I'm very glad to introduce Professor Edward Chang. He's a professor in ethnic studies at UC Riverside. He received PhD from UC Berkeley. He's doing a lot of fascinating work on the Korean American, African American relations, Asian Latino relations, immigration, and race relations theory. I had a lunch with him today. He also, because I'm from communication studies, and he did a work on media and race, how Korean American and African American relations are portrayed in different media outlets in the States. How newspaper in New York Times, report differently than newspaper in LA, which is LA Times, reflecting the differences between these two metropolitan cities and race relations in those cities as well. So I thought that's really fascinating work. Also, UC Riverside is about to launch a new center called the Center for Korean American Studies, which is one of the kind in the States. And Professor Chang will be a founding director of the center. And he does a lot of groundwork for the creation and development efforts for the center. So it's really great to hear that there's a university that is interested in Korean Americans in the States. So I thought that's really interesting as well. So title of today's talk is Korean Diaspora, History, Identity, and Community Consciousness. So please join me welcoming Professor Chang.
Thank you, Professor Kwok, for inviting me here to University of Michigan. And I believe I was on this campus about 10 years ago, attending Asian American Studies Conference. I believe it was it 99? 15? Wow. That means I'm getting old. And Scott is here, and former director of the center, David Chang, and Elder Nam, and everyone else who graciously attending this this talk. I would like to give my sincere thanks. And my talk today is kind of two separate topics. One is on Korean diaspora, comparative understanding of overseas Koreans in China, Japan, and former Soviet Union, Russia, and the United States. And second part is more of a LA civil unrest, riots, a rebellion, whatever you want to call it, and the whole context of Korean African-American relations, and what does it all mean. So I'm going to try to juggle around two different topics within next 45 minutes. And perhaps we could have a better discussion in Q&A, since we already spent 15 minutes from my original plan. So let me just quickly go over my PowerPoint, and it'll speed up. And when we discuss race and ethnicity in America, except in California, it's more of a black and white paradigm. And the Asian Americans oftentimes get left out, or oftentimes portrayed differently, or foreigners. Those are the very common perception. And I just want to touch upon what does it really mean to be American. And media portrayal in particular doesn't really see my face as American. Instead, they see me as a foreigner. I'm tired of Chris Yamaguchi's, Michelle Kwan's. I don't want these Oriental people winning all the time. They are not American. Tanya is an American. You guys know who Tanya is, right? Yes. She's an American, and Michelle Kwan, who happened to be a champion, U.S. champion from, I believe it was a 9-time U.S. champion and representing the United States of America in Olympics and World Figure Skating. And so I go on, and obviously it was Bill Handel is one of the renowned, very famous talk show hosts in KFI 640 AM. And he never issued apology. And he refused to issue apology, and that's the sad state of Professor Kwok briefly mentioned about how Asian Americans are represented in the media, in mainstream media. I just wanted to point that out. And that was another headline, American beats out Kwan. And right after the Michelle Kwan was upset by Tara Lipinski in Olympic Games in Japan in 1998. I don't know whether that sentence make any sense to you, but anyway, my real topic today is Korean diaspora. And in fact, to really understand the Korean diaspora, I just wanted to give you brief statistical data on how the composition, the demographic profiles of Korea is changing. Korea used to brag about being proud of being one race nation. And along with Japan, if you look at the homogeneity index, North Korea and South Korea had a 99% homogeneity, and Japan also claimed to be one race nation. But since 1997, the number of non-Koreans residing in Korea have increased rapidly, particularly in year 2007. Number of non-Koreans living in Korea has exceeded more than 1 million. And all of a sudden, I remember when I visited Korea about 3-4 years ago, where if I mention anything about multi-ethnicity, multi-ethnic, in Korean, multi-ethnic pronounced as a 다문화. So when I mention 다문화, people ask me, are you talking about tea room? 다문화 means a tea, something like that. Nobody really understood what I meant. But now, every Korean is talking about multicultural Korea. It's an inevitability, and everyone accepts Korea is no longer a one-race nation. And finally, they came to realization that Korea is a multi-ethnic, multiracial society. If it's going to be inevitable. There's a great acceptance of the term and inevitability of multi-ethnic community in Korean society. So that's been a remarkable change over the last 10 years. And if you look at the nationality of alien residents in Korea, of course, most dominant majority is Koreans from China. Those Koreans who migrated to China, mostly in northeast China, formerly known as Manchuria, and they have since come back to Korea to work as a foreign guest workers or foreign workers. And after normalization between China and South Korea in 1992, a lot of Korean Chinese came to Korea to work. And next is from the United States. And for those from Vietnam and Philippines, that they are mostly women, the Vietnamese and the Filipino women who married Korean men, and a lot of them live in countryside. So their number is increasing. So the inter-ethnic marriage rate is increasing rapidly in Korea. In fact, I saw a news report yesterday. 5 years from now, the Korean man is going to have a tough time finding Korean brides in Korea because of a gender imbalance. So it's increasingly becoming a problem in Korea. Okay, this is the kind of the chart I kind of made to give you comparative perspective of overseas Koreans in China, Japan, former Soviet Union, and the United States. Of course, there are United States and China has most number of Koreans residing. Of course, it's not accident that overseas Koreans are residing in these 4 countries, 4 nations. It has a lot to do with geopolitical, historical circumstances of where the Korea was situated in late 19th and early 20th century. So if the Korea is the only nation in the world that is still divided against own will, and Germany was united, and Vietnam was reunited in '75. The Korea is still suffering from Cold War, and the war never ended in Korea. And Korea is the only place in the world that the power of four major superpowers still clash and competing, and that's the only place in the world is the Korean Peninsula. And so that's probably one of the reasons why Korea is still divided, and a lot of Koreans have migrated to those countries. So if you look at the number of Koreans residing in China, 1.8, Japan, 700,000, that's somewhat misleading since many Koreans in Japan have become Japanese citizens. So that figure doesn't include those Koreans who have since become Japanese citizens. Only those Koreans who still retain their Korean citizenship. And the Soviet Union, 500,000, and the United States. If you ask Korean Americans how many Koreans live in the United States, most people will say 2 million or up. But I think that's a slight exaggeration. I think 1.5 is a more accurate number, but it's increasing. And if you kind of understand and look at the reasons why they migrated to those countries, it's a very similar. In the beginning, it's more of economic reasons. The Korea was suffering economic devastation in the late 19th century because of kingdoms and the corruptions, famine, and other reasons. And the ordinary Korean peasants, particularly in the northern states, were forced to migrate to Manchuria or the Soviet territory. They were going back and forth, and all of a sudden one day you couldn't come back. I mean, that's exactly what happened. So they were stuck if you happen to be in Russian territory, you're stuck in Russian territory. If you're living in the Chinese territory, you're stuck in Chinese territory. That's what happened. In the beginning, it was economic, but gradually later on, particularly after Korea was colonized by Japan in 1910, the political movements, independence fighters, guerrilla activities, the political reasons become more, makes much more sense, and a lot of people began to migrate to both in China and Soviet territory. And after 1920s and the 30s, the Japan, in preparation for World War II and ambition of conquering China as well as all entire Asia, began to forcibly relocate Korean laborers from Korea to Japan. And the number is not exact, but the scholars say maybe more than 5 million Korean young men and women were forcibly relocated to Japan, including about 200,000 Korean young girls were forcibly taken as sex slaves before World War II. So the number of Koreans in Japan were more than 2 million, but after the liberation of Korea, many of them came back, and the number have since dwindled to about 700,000. But the story is much more complicated than that, since the Korea is divided, Korean community in Japan is divided, whether you're pro-North, pro-South, so it's very complicated, so which I will not go into. And story of Koreans in Soviet Union is very similar, as both economic and political, but just like the Native Americans during 19th century who were forcibly relocated from eastern states, southern states to the kind of west of Mississippi. The entire population of Koreans who were living in the eastern part of Vladivostok and that area was forcibly relocated to Central Asia by Stalin regime. And Stalin did not trust Koreans occupying the borderland. So he decided to relocate entire population to Central Asia. So their story is, just Professor Chang made the documentary on it. Perhaps you had the opportunity to watch it, but it is a story that needs to be told over and over again, and we still don't know full context of it yet. There needs to be a lot of research on it. And finally, the Koreans in the United States, most of you, all your parents, many of you people you know, came after 1965 when the U.S. immigration law was liberalized in 1965. But there were some who came prior to that era, particularly those Korean pioneers who came between 1903 and 1905. Even before that, like Philip Jason, he came around 1890s. There were students and some businessmen, diplomats who came before that. So there are a lot of research needs to be done as well. In terms of their status in their respective countries, it is somewhat similar and different. In China, the Chinese Communist Party always brag that their minority policy is to grant autonomy to minority population. But within certain limit, the Chinese Communist Party, they set the policy and you have to operate within that guideline. So there is a limited autonomy, but still they brag that they give the autonomy. In fact, the Koreans in Northeast China have a Yanbian self-autonomous area where the Korean language is official language along with the Chinese. So therefore, they are able to maintain Korean language, culture, and whatever. On the other hand, in Japan, the official Japanese policy is to assimilate Koreans into Japanese. In fact, in order to become Japanese citizen, you have to show that you have to completely cut off from being Korean language, culture, and speaking whatever. And so you have to completely assimilate into becoming Japanese. So their policy is quite opposite of that of either China and Soviet Union. Soviet Union, both Soviet Union and China as a communist party, communist policies are very similar. There are some differences, but it's very similar. And in the United States, it used to be very assimilationist policy, but now we more of a practice, more of a multiculturalism and cultural pluralism. And so therefore, the status of Korean Americans and Asian Americans are somewhat in middle ground, as many scholars have already produced their articles and the books. And in that context, if you look at the languages they speak, it's quite interesting because in China, because they practice multiculturalism and bilingual biculturality, most Koreans in China, they speak Korean fluently, despite that they are third and the fourth generation, because they attend regular Korean language school. Therefore, they are able to retain and they are fluent bilingual in both Chinese and Korean. In Japan, for those 700,000 Koreans living in Japan, their legal status is Korean citizen. Most of them have accepted South Korean citizenship, but some still have North Korean citizenship. So they are Korean in legal status, but majority of them don't speak Korean. They are culturally, linguistically have become Japanese. So that's the kind of a irony here. And for those Koreans living in Soviet Union, many of them are consciously proud of Korean heritage, Korean ethnicity, but in terms of their cultural, linguistic practice, they speak Russian. And that has created more problem for those Koreans have settled in such places such as Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. Since then, that they have become independent nation, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And before that territory was under Russian territory, it was okay to speak Russian. But now, the Kazakhs and Uzbeks and other independent nations want their people to speak their own native tongue. Uzbek and Kazakh So that, therefore, they're having more problem, right? So it creating all kinds of problems for them. Of course, in the United States, some of you are bilingual, bicultural, some of you are monolingual, English only. So it depends on where you grew up, in what circumstance, geography. In fact, in Los Angeles, where I'm coming from, a lot of parents are complaining that their sons and daughters who are born and raised in the United States speak Konglish. They don't speak English fluently anymore since they hang out with the Korean kids and they watch Korean drama and Korean TV, Korean movie, listening to Korean song, and Hallyu, Korean wave. So it depends on, but I'm sure that you don't have that kind of problem here in Michigan, right? I hope not. Probably not in the East Coast either. So it kind of interesting to see where their current status in terms of the language you use and the cultural practices that in culture in China and Soviet Union and United States, I think is biculturalism, bilingualism, biculturalism is kind of a similar, except in Japan. Majority of them have become Japanized in terms of their gesture and etiquette, mannerism. I see a lot of Koreans in Japan, have Japanized, except those who attend North Korean schools. I know those who attend the North Korean school, they have a strong sense of nationalism and teach Korean language, whatnot. So that's why there are some differences. But since Korea is divided, it has caused major issues and the problems in their respective countries as well. For Koreans in China, until recently, they were pro-North Korea. But at the same time, since there are a lot of Korean Chinese who visited and worked in South Korea, since then they have returned back to China. Their feeling towards South Korea is ambivalent at best, since they have experienced discrimination in South Korean society. So their attitude towards South Korea is somewhat mixed, somewhat ambivalent. And in Japan, like I said already, that Koreans, they are divided with a pro-North, pro-South. So therefore, Koreans in Japan have suffered a great deal. And now, the third and the fourth generation Korean Japanese have decided, many of them have decided, forget about homeland politics. We need to focus on our own civil rights in Japan. We need to demand our voting rights, and we need to protect our civil rights. So their campaign and their activism is beginning to take some shape in Japan. Soviet Union, and of course here in the United States, 99% of Koreans in the United States are pro-South Korea, and very few pro-North Korea. So that's probably, I don't need to elaborate anymore. In terms of nationality, Koreans in China, they are Chinese citizens. There is no question about it. They are Korean ancestry of a Chinese citizen. In Japan, ironically, although majority of them don't speak Korean language and practice Korean culture, in terms of a legal status, they are Korean citizen. And Koreans in Soviet Union, their status is Russian, Uzbek, Kazakhstan, Kazakh, whatever. And in the United States, some have become American citizens. Miss Song, she just became American citizen. Welcome on board. But and others have remained permanent residents, and some of you are here on visiting scholars or student visa, whatever. And in terms of most interesting aspect about this is their identity. In Koreans in China, they call themselves as a Joseonjok. Joseonjok means the last dynasty before Korea was colonized by Japan in 1910. So it's called Joseon. The morning calm, right? So that's the reason why the Korea was known as the land of morning calm until recently they changed it to dynamic Korea. I don't know which one you like better, but 조선족. On the other hand, Koreans in China and Russia, they call themselves as a Goryeo 사람. Goryeo is a dynasty prior to Joseon dynasty. So I don't know why they chose this different identity, which is very interesting. And of course, Koreans in Japan is Jainichi, and Koreans here is Korean American. So they have their own distinct, unique, different identity. And I think it's based on their experience, historical experiences, as well as the minority policies, and it is different. But this is further needs to be more comparative analysis of this, the Korean residents, Koreans' status in their respective countries will provide more understanding of how minorities policies and their status, if there is any link or connection or whatever, needs to be further explored. And we can discuss about this in our Q&A session further. Okay, let me just move on. Of course, one of the distinct, unique characteristic, although there are several, of Korean Americans is that Korean Americans have the highest self-employment rates in the United States. That's a fact. It's been statistical data, census data consistently have shown since 1980. If you look at 1980, 90, 2000 census data, Korean Americans have the highest self-employment rates in the United States, higher than Chinese, Jewish, and any other group. That's a fact. This is based on year 2007 survey. And that brings me to the 1992, April 29th, 1992. And in the Korean American community, it's known as the historical event, a wake-up call, or turning point, a watershed event, or some have called Korean America was born or reborn on April 29th, 1992. Before LA civil unrest, LA riot of 1992, the term, the word, the Korean America rarely used. Majority of Korean immigrants were proud that they were Korean. They did not use the term Korean American. Instead, they were more proud to use the term Korean. And in fact, many of them refused to become Korean American citizen. There is a sense of great attachment to homeland. But after event in 1992, the Korean American became a new meaning, new word for defining what it means to be Korean American. And so there is a lot of discussion about that. But for Korean Americans, they have experienced what I call triple oppression. And of course, the Korean American community in Los Angeles, particularly those who are doing businesses in South LA as well as in Koreatown, have suffered disproportionate portion of economic losses. More than close to 2,300 Korean American owned businesses were either destroyed or looted or firebombed. The degree of losses, casualty are different, but overall about 2,300 Korean American owned businesses suffered some damages. Some stores were completely destroyed. And the Korean immigrants who came since 1965 were having a hard time really understanding why and how this happened in America. You know, many of them came to America believing in American dream. And American dream means what? I think it was very simple. The American dream is known around the world as America as a land of opportunities, to work hard, realize your economic wealth, right? That was the American dream. But during and after LA riots, so the civil unrest, it was a time of chaos. There was no one's there to protect, no one there to care about what was happening to your community. So it was very difficult for many Korean immigrants to comprehend, understand why this was happening. It was senseless to them, and many of them suffered from post-traumatic stress syndrome, and some of them never fully recovered from it. But it was very difficult for them to really grasp what was happening. And at the same time, most Americans really didn't know Korean or Korean American at the time, because Korea was still somewhere in between China and Japan. At most, and most Americans were accustomed to watching MASH every week. That was the extent that they knew of Korea. So all of a sudden, LA civil unrest exposed the dimension that they knew very little of. That is Korean. Who is Korean? Who is Korean American? Of course, the part that they were media showed quite constantly was one Korean man was shooting like this, about 1 second or 5 second soundbite. All Korean American merchants with rifles on the rooftop and trying to defend their stores. I think those were the images that were broadcasted widely around the globe, and not only in the United States but around the world. And Korean immigrants were portrayed as vigilantes, and rather than model minority was another image constantly projected. But these are some of the things that Korean American community had to endure. So at this time, since some of you may not have seen LA images, maybe I will show you some. No, that's not it. Oh, plays. I need to play. No, not that. I just wanted to show you some images. Yeah.
When the riots came, it was very clear to me that not every store was looted, not every store was burned, but almost every single Korean-owned enterprise was burned and looted.
I think the perception was Koreans joined the rest of non-black Americans in looking down on me and thinking that I'm junk and thinking that I'm absolutely nothing. It was wrath, because the pattern of the burning shows there were some stores not burned. They were protected. Guys would stand out in front and protect it, just as the churches were not burned, just as black businesses to a large extent were not burned. Some black businesses that were considered traitorous towards blacks were burned. But there is enough of a pattern in the burnings to cause one to question, were blacks hateful of Koreans merely because they were Koreans? Or were blacks hateful of the disposition of Korean merchants.
After the verdict, we began receiving phone calls from the Korean.
Okay. I'd like to share more, but I only have 10 more minutes. So let me just keep going. Oh, I need to go to slideshow. Oh, okay. Of course, the race riots were very common during 20th century, and 1917 East St. Louis riot, Chicago riots of 1919, Harlem riots of 1943. Of course, there were numerous race riots in the entire United States during 1960s, namely 65 Watts riots, and all these race riots during the 20th century were caused. There was many commission reports have issued a report saying there were three basic causes of these race riots: economic inequality between blacks and whites, haves and have-not means blacks and whites, lack of educational and employment opportunities in the United States as a result. During the 60s and the 70s, it was very obvious that black schools were inferior in terms of the fundings, quality of facilities, teachers. The black schools were receiving less funding than the white schools. Therefore, they were getting inferior education and unable to compete in a labor market. That was the finding of a major commission reports. And also the police brutality and distrust of a police force have caused this clash between residents of inner city and the police force. And 1992 was somewhat different because 1992 was perhaps America's first multi-ethnic civil unrest, a multi-ethnic riot, because not only blacks and the whites were involved, but also Latinos, many Latino residents in South LA, Pico Union, and Asians and Korean immigrant business owners were involved. And not only that, previous race riots in America were geographically confined within African American neighborhood. It usually starts in inner city and quickly put down by the police force within. However, 1992 was different from, I don't know if you know LA geography, but major corridor north and the south connecting is Western Avenue and Vermont Avenue. And from South LA along the Vermont and Western Avenue, entire corridor all the way up to Hollywood Boulevard were torched by the firebomb. So not only African American neighborhood, South LA, but also it affected mostly Latino community of Pico Union, Koreatown, and all the way into Hollywood. So it was a wide scale, but would not affect the western part, predominantly white community, were not affected. But there is some controversy about it too. But anyway, let me just quickly talk about Korean African American relations of the 1980s. Of course, prior to 1980s, most of the inner city stores, particularly during the 60s, were owned and operated by Jewish store owners. But many Jewish store owners left African American neighborhood, particularly during and after race riots that swept the nation. And in LA, after Watts riots, Jewish store owners began to leave. And after getting their insurance money or whatever, they decided to sell and leave the area. So there was some vacancy between 1960s and the early part of 1970s. That's when the Korean immigrants began to arrive in the United States. And these Korean immigrants came with very little history or knowing racial history in the United States. They simply arrived in the United States believing in American dream. That means to work hard and succeed. They knew nothing about civil rights movement. They knew nothing about segregation. They knew nothing about race and ethnic relations in America. And that was the context. They came in. They saw the opportunity. They saw the businesses in inner city, South LA, was cheap. And you could, if you work hard, you could make a lot of money, which some people did. Some people did. And gradually, by mid-1980s in Los Angeles, most of the stores in inner city, South LA, became owned by Korean immigrant business owners. It just happened in about 10, 15 years. And in the meantime, we're having some problems. Communication problems was one. The Korean immigrants spoke very little English. And second, and many African American residents began to complain. The Korean immigrants were rude and disrespectful. They do not live in the community. They sell inferior products at higher price. They do not contribute to the community organizations. And these were the common complaints you heard not only in Los Angeles, but you heard the same complaints in New York City, Washington, Chicago, Detroit, everywhere the Korean businesses dominated. You heard the same stories, the same complaints. And that's the context and the proliferation of the conflict between the two communities were intensifying. And finally, in January 18, 1990, in New York City, Brooklyn, the Red Apple boycott. It made a lot of news. Red Apple is the name of the store, owned and operated by the Korean Americans, and had a dispute with the Haitian immigrant. And it became Korean-Black conflict, and which this boycott lasted about 15 months. Began January 18, 1990, and ended in May 1990. And by the time this Red Apple boycott was about to end, another incident took place in Los Angeles. March 3rd, 1991, infamous Rodney King beating videotape. 13 days later, in South LA in Los Angeles, 15-year-old girl, Latasha Hollins, was shot and killed by Korean American woman, Sun Ja-do, known as Sun Ja-do case in Korean American community, in African American community known as Latasha Hollins, so whichever. But those two incidents were captured, one by the security camera, the other by the video camera. And LA media showed those two images every day, I don't know how many times, but maybe 10, 20, 30 times a day. From between March 1991 to April 29, 1992. You saw those two images every day in newscasts for entire year, more than a year. You're sending signal, you're sending some kind of signal, media. So I do believe media, electronic media in particular, along with the LA Times, played a critical role in during and after LA riots. I mean, the media driven. And perhaps I don't have much time to talk about LA Times and New York Times, but maybe we can do that in Q&A. But basically, LA Times portrayed Korean immigrant business owners as a rude and disrespectful, and leaders of African American community has a legitimate complaints, and they have a right to protest. On the other hand, New York Times portrayed the Korean business owners as a model minority And leaders of a boycott, such as Sonny Carson, Al Sharpton, as a racist. So therefore, their portrayal, depiction of Korean business owners were quite opposite. But anyway, let me just go forward. Let me just point out how it affected Korean American community. I think this is one of the important lessons that the Korean American community have learned. One is, as a result of LA civil unrest, LA riots, Korean Americans have gained visibility. Now, everybody knows Korean Americans. They know whether it's a positive, negative, it doesn't matter. Korean America is finally on the map in the United States. It's no longer sandwiched between Chinese and Japanese Americans. Instead, the Korean Americans are visible. And the birth of Korean American identity, the Korean Americans have themselves have embraced, accepted the Korean American identity. I think which is a very important turning point. And second issue is that Korean Americans have, until that time, they were mainly focusing on economic wealth, economic success as their main goal. That was their American dream, was to become successful economically. But finally, they realized that economic success alone is not enough. You have to gain political empowerment, political representation, and political access has become very important, imminent goal of the Korean American community. And third, generational cooperation between first generation, immigrant generation, and 1.5 and second generation became very possible, that particularly those 1.5 and second generation have played a critical role communicating with mainstream media and gave a voice and face to the English, the Korean-speaking immigrant generation, their parents' generation. So they were able to really articulate and give a voice to the immigrant community. And another issue is that, as you know, the Korean American community is church dominant. Church is the dominant institution in the Korean American community, whether it's a religious reason, economic, political, cultural reasons. The church is the focal point, is a center of a Korean American activity, Korean American community. And so you raised a fundamental question of what is the role of a Korean immigrant church? What should be the role of a Korean immigrant church? You raised a lot of questions. In other words, you have to go beyond serving your membership, your congregation member. What is the role of Korean American church in the greater community? I think that's the question here has arose. And finally, perhaps the most important lessons of a Korean American community is that you no longer have to, no longer can afford to stay within your own ethnic enclave and speak Korean and isolate yourself. Instead, you have to become proactively get involved in multi-ethnic, multi-racial community. And I think Korean American community have done that they reached out to the other Asian American groups, other African American Latino groups and white communities, try to engage in dialogue and understand. And it should be more of a give and take, but Korean American community is playing that role, and I think that is one of the most important lessons that Korean American community have learned as a result of LA civil unrest of 1992. And I'm going to end my talk here, and maybe we can have a Q&A. Thank you so much.